Today on the State of Purple podcast, we break down the reported new hire of Kwesi Adofo-Mensah as the Minnesota Vikings' new general manager. What do we know about him? Was he really the team's first choice? And what are the first orders of business now that he is in office? All of that and more on today's episode of the State of Purple podcast presented by Pilot Games.
Seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Diggs. Stay up. Oh my God. 30. No. 10. Touchdown. Are you kidding me? Miracle finish. It's a Minneapolis miracle. Oh my God. No way. What a miracle finish!
And welcome into the State of Purple podcast. I'm Aj Mansour. He's Jack Day. And a lot of news to cover today, Jack, as we have reports, nothing official yet, that the Minnesota Vikings have hired a new general manager. Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is his name. He comes to Minnesota from Cleveland. Jack, before we dive in super in-depth, I want your first impressions. A couple weeks ago, none of us knew who this guy was. Tell us what your thoughts are, your first impression thoughts on Kwesi Adofo-Mensah as the new Minnesota Vikings general manager.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think the Vikings fan base as a whole should be pretty excited because the Wilfs essentially put their money where their mouths were, and they hired something different. They went a different direction than what they've gone in their 60-plus year history. I've been a fan of what the Browns have done throughout the draft process. That's my favorite time of the year, getting into the draft process. I've been a fan of what the Browns did last year. Really thought their draft was an A+, one of the top draft classes in the entire draft last year. So looking forward to it. I think this is a hire that a lot of the people are, I'll quote this and say the nerds love this because he does have that analytical mind, economics major, bachelor's degree and master's degree from the Ivy League. So I think Vikings fans should be excited. And now we're one step closer to figuring out who the head coach is going to be for this team as well.
Yeah, Jack, we'll take a step back because news broke yesterday, actually, kind of in reverse order, that Ryan Poles was going to sign with the Chicago Bears. The two finalists were going to interview with the Minnesota Vikings this week. Adofo-Mensah scheduled to interview on Tuesday, and then today was supposed to be the interview with Ryan Poles, the two finalists. Before that second interview happened with anybody, really, news started to leak out of Chicago that Poles was choosing Chicago, the Bears were choosing Poles, and that it was Kwesi Adofo-Mensah left for the Minnesota Vikings to pick as their lone finalist. And it became a negotiation process where the two sides try and figure out how are we going to make this work and how do we get this done? How do we make this announcement? Again, technically, we still have not heard an official announcement. So that's not weird. It's not concerning. The report is out. I think it was Schefter who brought it this morning and said that it's done. They're just kind of maybe figuring out some particulars, waiting to announce the way that they want to announce. But Jack, I think the first impression, and this is based off of, again, 2 weeks of learning who these people were. None of us knew who these, vice presidents of football operations and player personnels were for other teams around the league until they became candidates for general manager 2 weeks ago when the Vikings cleared house with Rick Spielman. The initial reaction based off of social media, I think I felt it a little bit too, was a little bit of I don't want to say disappointment, but maybe a hierarchy where Ryan Poles was the preferred choice by most of the fans. Now, where that comes from, I think, is that anybody out of Kansas City is the preferred choice over anybody out of Cleveland. How did you feel initially when Ryan Poles chose Chicago, or the Bears chose Poles, or however that order goes, and the Vikings were there with Adofo-Mensah?
Yeah, I think how Vikings fans should look at this more is not that they missed out on something. I think it should be looked at more as like a 1A, 1B, if you will. I think the fact of the matter is nobody knows what either of the two are going to be. until 3-4 years down the road when they get into the building and they get their hands on the respective rosters that they just took over. So I don't think anyone can really be overly excited or overly mad about the hiring until we get to that point and see what happens. I know if it were the other way around and the Vikings would have hired Poles, you and I would have been up here talking about, hey, Patrick Mahomes was drafted. They rebuilt that offensive line. There's been some exciting stuff to come out of Cleveland as well. Some stuff that we're going to dive into later on in the show. But I don't think Vikings fans should feel like they missed out. I think there was a little bit of it felt as if Poles was the front runner / favorite. But there's another side of me where I wonder, why would the Wilfs and their hiring committee leak that? They would keep that close to the chest. And Kwesi was the first one to interview. It wasn't Poles. Right. It was Kwesi that got into the building first. So part of that makes me wonder, maybe they really did want to do a complete 180, kind of turn the direction of this franchise around and do something different. They preached that after they fired Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer. They preached that they wanted to do something different. Like I said earlier, they put their money where their mouth is. They did that. And I think there's going to be an exciting couple years in the next few years for the Minnesota Vikings fan base.
Right. And we don't know what Ryan Poles was responsible for, right? It's easy to say, yeah, they had Patrick Mahomes. They've drafted a good offensive line. They've done these things that have turned themselves into the juggernaut that the Kansas City Chiefs are. We don't know what Poles was responsible for, if anything, right? There's other people in play in that organization in Kansas City above him. There is the general manager, there's coaches, there's a lot that goes on there. He might not have had anything to do with Kansas City's success, but he came from that lineage and maybe brings some of that theology with him to the Chicago Bears. That's why it makes him exciting. But Jack, what it does is it does raise a question that I think that we had taken for granted here in Minnesota, but people are talking about it across the country now, questioning on what job is actually the most desirable landing spot. Minnesota Vikings, there was a report out of Sports Illustrated, I think, that they graded all these things from the draft picks to the quarterback to the fan base to the salary cap space to all these spots on what is the most desirable landing spot open. Now, they did it for head coaches, and they said that the head coaching job in Minnesota was the second most desirable landing spot, just behind the Las Vegas Raiders. Some of that carries over for general manager, not all of it, though. In your opinion, is Chicago a more desirable landing spot? They announced first, but does that mean that Poles chose Chicago over Minnesota, or did it just happen to leak to the press first?
I think it might have just happened to leak to the press first. I don't think, from everything that I've seen, stemming from watching the Wilfs press conference and some of the ownership press conference after the Bears let go of Nagy and their GM, just looking at the ownership alone, it seemed like Minnesota is a more desirable place to be. And on top of that, there's been some rumors circulating about Soldier Field potentially moving away from that. I know they bought a plot of land. That is a whole lot of work for a GM, a front office to kind of, I mean, I'm sure you're well aware of this, the whole ordeal with Lester Bagley trying to get that stadium here. But that's a ton of work. And I think the fact that they have a brand new practice facility, they have a good amount of talent on the roster. There's an article that you wrote a couple weeks back about Kirk Cousins being on the roster, whether he wants to tie himself to Kirk Cousins or not. That's a good thing. And I think the jury is still out on Justin Fields. I don't know. Right. I had someone reply to one of my tweets today with, what would the GM position look like for the Vikings right now had Rick Spielman traded up and drafted Justin Fields? Would Rick Spielman still be in Minnesota? I don't know. But I think that's the unknown is what excites me the most. But to answer that question, I do not think Chicago is the more desirable job. They do have a young quarterback on a rookie contract, which is a good thing. But I think you can argue that there's other side, like you already have done, that coming into a brand new facility with a brand new stadium with a veteran quarterback already in stone, whether that or not they want to move on or stick with Kirk Cousins, I think that is a more of a positive thing for a new GM. So it just feels like Minnesota would be the more desirable spot. I know that Poles already had a brief stint in Chicago when he got drafted as an undrafted free agent.
I think he's from Chicago too.
Yeah,
right?
there's a little bit where it's like, if I grew up in Minnesota my entire life and they took a chance on me, I think there'd be a little bit more of a drive for me to want to go to Minnesota. So I think that's something that people need to take into perspective as well.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. We'll take this opportunity real quick, Jack, just to remind everybody we're recording this as a live interactive video chat. So if you're watching on the video stream, feel free to throw in the comments. We'll take some Q&A session at the end of today's podcast. So if you have comments on the hire, if you have questions about anything coming up with the future of this organization, feel free to throw those in the comment section. We'll get to those at the end. Jack, back to, again, it's a report. It's not official yet. Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, the new general manager for the Minnesota Vikings. What do we know about him? He comes from Cleveland. He had time as a director of research and football development in San Francisco for 7 years. So there's some ties there. Tell me what you know about him and what we're all learning right now about the new Vikings GM.
Yeah, I'll start out by saying he is 40. He's not 32, which I put in my first article.
That was a weird place. And I couldn't figure out today if he was 32, 33, someplace had him, or 40. And eventually you kind of do the math and say, okay, he went to college in 99 and figure it out. But there's a lot of misinformation on the internet. So you got to be careful, especially with these kind of fringe celebrities. So I'm sorry, carry on. He's 40 years old.
Yeah. And you're going to see this all over Twitter, no matter where you go. The word, Ben Lieber had a couple good tweets about it today, but he gets labeled as this analytical person that rightfully so. He's a genius, essentially. My source spent some time with him yesterday, just said he's a super cool dude, seems down to earth. So that's a cool thing. I'm looking forward to seeing the press conference as well. And once this stuff does become official, I think it's going to make this a little bit more fun. But yeah, like you said, he spent 7 years in San Francisco. And one of the things that I liked the most about hearing about his time in San Francisco was, yes, he comes from an economic background, but what he did when he got to San Francisco was he sat down in the room with that scouting department. And I've heard several people label him as a sponge with knowledge. He just absorbs knowledge. And I don't think you want any other trait out of a GM. You want someone that can go and sit down with the scouts. He can sit down with other front office personnel and just soak up as much knowledge as possible. I think that's very clear that he can do that. He's only been in the NFL for like 8-9 years now, and he's already now reportedly being hired as a GM, and I think that should be exciting. Couple other things here. I had something else written down. Worked on Wall Street. I thought that was cool. Just really random that he went from I think it was after he got his bachelor's degree, he went and worked on Wall Street for a while, then went to Stanford, got his master in economics, and then ended up out in San Francisco. Andrew Berry, the GM in Cleveland, it was his right-hand man. He was involved with a lot of the draft process, not just the analytical stuff, but diving in, scouting these players as well. And I think that's exciting. I think the biggest thing that I wanted to say was just that sponge nugget. I thought that was cool that he can just soak up a bunch of knowledge and utilize that and have that as a strong suit. I think that's going to do wonders for this Vikings organization.
Yeah, no doubt. A couple other things that I dug up, Jack. You could find more of this at KFAN.com on the Vikings blog. Comes from the Cleveland Browns, 2 seasons as vice president of football operations there. 40 years old, Ivy League degree in economics, then went to Stanford for that master's degree in economics, like you mentioned, Jack. 7 seasons with the San Francisco 49ers, jumping around a couple different positions. That'll come up in a little bit, Jack. We'll get to that and what that might mean. But he landed the job in Cleveland thanks to a chance elevator encounter at the 2019 NFL scouting combine in Indianapolis, when he actually hopped in that elevator with then vice president of football operations for the Philadelphia Eagles, Andrew Berry. They hit it off, chatted for 15 minutes, exchanged phone numbers. Berry then jumps over to Cleveland as the general manager, brings Adofo-Mensah with him, and the rest is history there. He was a walk-on basketball player at Princeton. He grew 8 inches as a freshman in college. So he went from a small guy to a tall guy and played basketball. He didn't play much. He said he quoted himself as calling himself the try-hard guy. He was more of a practice squad walk-on player at Princeton. But he has coaching candidate ties that we'll get into. He's heavy in the analytics games, and he thinks that he'd be pretty good at Jeopardy, depending on what the topics are. Don't we all? That's one of those things that if you can control the topics, you can be good at it. But he's very intelligent. We know that, whether it comes to the economic side, the Wall Street side, the football side, he brings a wide variety of things to the table. But Jack, the number one thing that we're all going to be talking about is what this means for the head coaching hire. It's the number one job first thing, a first order of business as he comes into Minnesota is hiring that new head coach. There are some ties from his history to some of the coaching candidates, some of the interviewees that the Minnesota Vikings have already met with. Do you think that factors in? And where do you think there's interesting steam? I don't know if you heard PA today that if on another coaching candidate without a tie necessarily to Kwesi, but tell me first off what you think his ties to 49ers, his ties to the Browns mean for those coaching candidates.
Yeah, I believe PA, I might have missed what you're talking about, but I do think he said something about how he felt as if the Vikings' next head coach is coaching this coming weekend.
He did
Obviously,
say that, yes.
When he comes from San Francisco, DeMeco Ryans just came off of a wonderfully coached game. That probably strikes a little bit closer to home for the Vikings fans listening because it was in Lambeau Field, and they just beat Aaron Rodgers at Lambeau Field without Jimmy Garoppolo throwing a touchdown, which I have no idea how that even happens, but that defense has been on point. The offensive coordinator is another one. I'm spacing on his name right now for San Francisco. I have it down here somewhere. Mike McDaniel. He's the one that there's been a lot of people saying we just need to combine the nerds, if you will, because if you watch his press conferences, he is a funny guy as well. I still think there's a tie to the offensive coordinator with the Rams, Kevin O'Connell, as well. Another interesting thing, I don't think there's any ties to the Rams defensive coordinator, Raheem Morris, but I did see someone say on Twitter that they interviewed for the GM, and then all of a sudden the next day they requested to bring in Raheem Morris for an interview. I don't know if Adofo-Mensah had something to do with that they talked about that in that interview, but I think that's another name that's certainly worth monitoring. And hey, all four of those coaches that I just brought up, they all play against each other this weekend in the NFC Championship game.
Yeah, so a couple other coaches that have ties to Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. I'll get the name smoothly at some point. Right now, I'm still having to think about it every time I say it. Jim Harbaugh actually is a past co-worker of his time during his time with the San Francisco 49ers. Harbaugh was the head coach early in Kwesi's time with San Francisco. It popped up over the weekend that Jim Harbaugh is now considered, getting some steam as far as an option for the Minnesota Vikings. Maybe this has something to do with that. Maybe it is the relationship that he has with Kwesi or some past performances there. Harbaugh, of all the, I don't particularly love the idea of a college quarterback coming to the NFL. It's different enough. I don't like that. I don't think it's a guaranteed success thing. But Harbaugh already has success at the NFL level. He's already taken that San Francisco 49ers team far. Was he the coach when they went to the Super Bowl?
I believe so. Wasn't it both the Harbaugh brothers that played each other in the Super Bowl? Or am I mistaken?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So he's gone to the Super Bowl. He's had deep runs in the playoffs. He has had NFL success. Then he jumped ship and went to Michigan for a dream job at the University of Michigan, and then is considering coming back now if the opportunity is right. So I don't hate the Jim Harbaugh idea as far as a guy from college. You mentioned the offensive coordinator, Kevin McDaniel, ties to San Francisco. DeMeco Ryans ties to San Francisco. One of the things that PA mentioned early in the show was with Kwesi being an analytics guy, a organizational guy trying to work behind the scenes, focusing on that side of stuff, maybe developing and building a team. He might find some guys to delegate responsibilities more. So he might find guys, especially for a head coach, you don't mess with the head coach as the general manager, but guys that can do that. So guys that he has a good working relationship with and he trusts, that's a benefit right away off the bat for a first-year general manager that doesn't have to worry about the head coach because he knows what he does. So anyone who has a relationship with him might be an interesting tidbit or an interesting tie to this position. Now, Jack, the one guy that PA must have gotten some steam at in the middle of his show, because he wasn't talking about him at the beginning of the show. I heard what you were talking about when he talked about, the guys that are playing this weekend. And he, by the end of the show, he had a different person as the front runner for the head coaching job for the Minnesota Vikings. He had, this guy first. I'll get to him in a second. He had Kevin O'Connell, offensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams, as the second most likely option. And then he had a tie. So he had 4 options. But he had a tie for third with the 2 coordinators from San Francisco, DeMeco Ryans and Mike McDaniel. But that number 1 spot, he gained steam throughout the show 9 to noon today. Oh, man, I just blanked on his name. The offensive coordinator out of Green Bay, Nate
Hackett, I believe.
Nathaniel Hackett. Nate, we're tight. Yeah, we're good buds. Nathaniel Hackett. Something happened in the middle of the show today where PA started talking about Nathaniel Hackett and put him, even at the end of his show, put him as the front runner for the head coaching position now. So something to pay attention to as the week goes on. Now that these dominoes have started to fall for the general manager positions, we will hear very quickly some ideas and thoughts about the head coaching positions, because now there's 2 more teams that are in the market ready to go quick for these head coaching positions. So all the guys who just had head coaches to worry about didn't have to worry about the Vikings and Bears because they were hiring a general manager first. Now that's done. Now they're in. They're ready to go. They're ready to snipe somebody from another team. They're ready to go at it. So we're going to start seeing those dominoes fall too, either later this week or early next week. It's going to come, and it's going to come hot and heavy. So just something to watch there. Again, I don't know where the Nathaniel Hackett stuff came from, but after I hop off here, I'm going to do my deep dive on Hackett and figure out what the tie might be or what the connection might be, and do my research there. Jack, the first order of business for the new general manager we've already talked about, finding a head coach. The second order of business for this general manager, there's some options here. Where do you pin the second order of business for Kwesi Adofo-Mensah as he comes in to this position?
I'm assuming we're talking about the quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings, which I'm sure is gonna draw some criticism. But yeah, I just personally, I don't see him coming in here, bringing in a new head coach and saying, you know what, we're going to extend Kirk Cousins for 3 to 4 years, and we're going to have not only are we going to see or like have the standard of Vikings football be Kirk Cousins for the next 4 years, but we're going to tie our careers, our future to this quarterback. I don't know if Kirk Cousins, I know he's been phenomenal. He's been very good, but with they're going to need cap space. I think you're going to see a complete overhaul on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, that's bound to happen when Mike Zimmer handpicked a bunch of guys and brought them in on 1-year deals. They're going to have to find, not only are they going to have to find some new starters, they're going to have to find some depth too. And I don't know where that cap space is going to come from. And Kirk Cousins is the biggest cap hit on this team. And right now, with the roster that they're likely going to go into 2022 with, I don't know if the Vikings, and this kind of stems from, we can kind of tie everything together that we're talking about because we have an article or a couple articles we're going to talk about at the end of the show. But watching that Bills-Chiefs game, I don't think the Vikings are even close to that level of football yet with Kirk Cousins. And I'm not saying Kirk Cousins can't compete with those quarterbacks on the right roster, but I don't think the Vikings have the right roster to find success with Kirk Cousins in 2022. And that's going to bother a lot of people, I think, on one side of the spectrum. And I think you and I have both made ourselves very clear. We're not really on either side of the spectrum.
Yeah,
we have had faith in Kirk Cousins. I'm not saying that Kirk Cousins could get traded to another team. I mean, look what, like I just was talking about, the San Francisco 49ers did. Kirk Cousins could go into Lambeau and not throw a touchdown and win a football game. But they don't have the team in place in Minnesota to do that, I don't think. And I just think moving on from all that money and kind of reassessing what needs to get done, rebuild that defense, maybe find a right guard that can actually play right guard in the NFL, and then see what happens. If you bring in, everyone says you can't find success with rookie quarterbacks, especially when the rookie class isn't supposed to be good. But most rookie quarterbacks that come in the NFL get stuck on bad rosters. We're seeing it with Trevor Lawrence, with Zach Wilson. That's not the case in Minnesota. It's not a dumpster fire of a roster yet. I mean, we could talk about this 2 or 3 years down the road and that could change. But right now, you put a rookie quarterback in that offense, they're going to be getting Irv Smith Jr. back next year, who I think is a up-and-coming, very promising tight end. He was the talk of training camp this summer. Delvin Cook, top 3 running back. Justin Jefferson, top 3 wide receiver. Adam Thielen hasn't shown signs of slowing down. And oh, hey, by the way, the offensive line is young, getting better, and there's actually depth at the wide receiver position now. So I don't think it's as atrocious of a situation for a rookie quarterback to walk into. And personally speaking, I feel like that is the direction I would go in if I were the GM stepping in this role, just because I don't know if I'd want to tie my name to Kirk Cousins for the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, there are a couple options, obviously, with the head coach, the quarterback position. The most likely is you stick out this season with Kirk Cousins and then assess it from there. Either find a way to sign him after the season if he wants to be here, which he says he does, but it's going to be at a much more reasonable rate. Kirk Cousins, we've said this, is a good quarterback, but he's not worth the value that they're paying for him now. That's the moral of the story. Okay. He needs more around him. They can't afford more around him to protect him, to give him the offensive line he needs to succeed the way that he can succeed. So they just needed to make a fix. Now Jack, some interesting things happen when you get a new general manager into town. And it didn't take long for some of those interesting things and those rumors to start swirling. One of them became very interesting. It's one that we've heard before, so it makes a little sense. But now that there is a direct tie between Minnesota and Cleveland, this was yesterday afternoon after the news of Ryan Poles came out that he was going to Chicago and it was left for Kwesi Adofo-Mensah here in Minnesota. That rumors out of Cleveland.com specifically, Mary Kay Kabat was talking on their live web stream about the potential of trading Baker Mayfield for Kirk Cousins. There'd have to be some more there to figure things out and get the numbers better and whatever. But the opportunity of trading Baker Mayfield to Minnesota, what that might look like, what that might mean for these two teams. I'm going to pull up a clip here. We're going to watch this together. If you're listening on the podcast, you can listen to it. And then we'll talk about it, Jack. The possibility of right off the bat, a trade from the new general manager's old team to the Minnesota Vikings.
If Kwesi is the general manager in Minnesota and they want to do some things in terms of trading Kirk Cousins or rebuilding or whatever the case may be, then of course there would be a discussion, I would think, that would take place between them and the Cleveland Browns about Kirk Cousins, because as we mentioned before, the Browns are going to have to turn over every single stone to make sure they have the best team they can get going forward. That of course includes everything, including quarterback. I mean, they never said they wouldn't do that. They have to do that. I mean, Andrew Berry is obligated to try to make this team better at every single position. So if something look into it, and now he would have a great working relationship with Kwesi where they could, maybe try to pull something like that off if it gets to that point. But rest assured, over the next couple of months, you will be hearing things, I'm sure, pop out here and there about inquiries and different things of that nature.
All right. You can get more on this at KFAN.com right now. What would mean, Jack? The contracts are vastly different. I think Baker Mayfield is like $18.8 million against the cap next year. Kirk Cousins, $45 million. Both are entering what we would call a prove-it year, right? Kirk Cousins needs to prove his value. He's proven that he's a good quarterback in the NFL, that he's a starting quarterback in the NFL. But what's his value into the future? Baker Mayfield needs to maybe prove that he can be a starting quarterback in the NFL. He's had ups and downs. He's shown signs. He's shown struggles. He's had injuries. He's done these things. He needs to prove whether or not he can be another opportunity for a team into the future. So Minnesota Vikings have an opportunity to lower the cap hit for a lesser player, clearly a lesser player. But you lower the cap hit this year, you maybe start developing a team for a young quarterback into the future. That's the thought there with the Minnesota Vikings. But the conversation there's now a direct pipeline, multifaceted direct pipeline between Cleveland and Minnesota. Kevin Stefanski's there. You have Kwesi Adofo-Mensah here now. The opportunity for conversations has never been better between Minnesota and Cleveland. What are your thoughts on Baker Mayfield for Kirk Cousins and the possibility of any sort of trade there?
I honestly don't love it. There's a few reasons that go into that, and it's not me trying to sit up here and say, hey, look at the year that Baker Mayfield just had. It was atrocious. The Odell Beckham Jr. stuff, once he leaves and goes to the Rams, hey, now he's playing in the NFL championship game and scoring touchdowns. I think Baker Mayfield can be a good quarterback in the NFL, but the Vikings have a good quarterback. I know the money is, and I just kind of am going against what I just said, but what worries me a little bit with Baker Mayfield coming here, and this is kind of a stretch, I might be reaching here a little bit, but the problems that Odell Beckham Jr. had with Baker Mayfield, that got blown up. Odell's dad was tweeting about it. And you know who's really, really, really tight with Odell Beckham Jr.? Minnesota Vikings wide receiver Justin Jefferson. I don't know if that would be an issue if he came in here. Like I said, I do think Baker Mayfield is getting a lot of hate this year. The guy was playing hurt. And honestly, it might be a good changeup for the Vikings because although I don't think Baker Mayfield is quite on the same talent level as Kirk Cousins, I do think Baker Mayfield plays with a little bit more of an edge. He's got a little bit more of a swagger to his game. You don't see Kirk Cousins beating Ohio State when he was playing at Michigan State and planting the Michigan State flag in the center of the O at Ohio State. Baker Mayfield to do that. He will get in your face. He's a little bit different caliber of a quarterback. and he runs his mouth a little bit more and has that chip on his shoulder. He's been like that since his college days, where he was a walk-on, transferred to Oklahoma, and then kind of the rest is history. He was a first overall selection in the NFL draft for a reason. I don't think there was really any questions. Now you're looking back at that 2018 draft. It was Baker Mayfield followed by Sam Darnold and then Josh Allen, and Lamar Jackson was the 32nd overall pick in that 2018 class. I think some of those teams that picked, or the two teams that picked Darnold and Baker, are now questioning maybe, hey, we'd rather have Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen. But I don't think that would necessarily be a long-term solution. Maybe it is more of a thing where the Vikings make that trade, draft a quarterback, and have Baker in here as a bridge type quarterback. But if the Vikings go in that route, I don't know if they should necessarily even be paying $19-20 million for that bridge type quarterback. If they could go out and get a Gardner Minshew or Marcus Mariota for much, much cheaper. And at the end of the day, if they draft a rookie quarterback, I think this fan base would eventually want to see him on the field at some point in 2022. With Baker Mayfield here, I'm not sure that happens.
And if they went for someone cheaper, a cheaper option, that would still probably include trading Kirk Cousins, but just for different assets, whether those are draft picks, offensive linemen, other starters, whatever. Because you can't have that contract on record if you're looking to build that team and develop elsewhere. So just an interesting tidbit that popped up, mere 4 hours after the news of Kwesi being the finalist for the Minnesota Vikings. Jack, we have one final topic we're going to get to here. But before we do that, I want to give the opportunity for anybody who's viewing right now, throw some questions in that question comment section underneath this stream right now, and we'll get to a question and answer session right after this. But our closing topic for today, Jack, I put out an article earlier this week. You put out some content on quarterbacks in the NFL. What does a quarterback that is costing your team $40 million look like? The premise of my article was coming from this last week, and specifically that Sunday night game when we saw Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes, both $40 million quarterbacks, and what a $40 million quarterback actually looks like. So what goes into a quarterback that costs you $40 million, maybe specifically, Jack, that we don't believe Kirk Cousins has?
I think you can take a little bit out of what I was just talking about with Baker Mayfield. Like, I think Kirk Cousins has enough talent to last in the NFL for a long time. Obviously he does. He already has done that. But to continue his career, 33, 34 years old now, I believe, to continue that up into his upper 30s. But it's something that it goes back and forth, and the consistency just hasn't really been there. Yes, at the end of the season, Kirk Cousins wants to look back after that January 9th. I'm never going to let that go because that still just bothers me how he says, hey, don't ask me how my season has gone until January 9th. Why, if you're the quote unquote leader of a football team in the NFL, why is that your end goal? To get to January 9th and then look at your stats? Get to the playoffs and make a deep run, and no one's going to care what your stats look like. I can promise you that. And you're not going to have to pay for a single meal in the state of Minnesota for the rest of your life if that happens. So I just feel like there's a different persona, a different swagger that these top quarterbacks play with. Joe Burrow just got sacked 10 times playing behind an atrocious offensive line. That has been a blame on Kirk, or saying for Vikings fans that kind of stand for Kirk Cousins, hey, the offensive line hasn't been there. It's not there in Cincinnati, and they're going to the AFC Championship game because their quarterback has a lot more swag, and when the moments matter the most, that's when he makes his biggest plays. And you can argue and say Joe Burrow didn't have that great of a game. I don't care. Look at the moments where the lights are shining the brightest. He comes through. Go back and watch the semifinal game where he threw 4 touchdowns to Justin Jefferson in that national championship game. It was one of the most prolific offenses we have ever seen in college football history. And then he gets hurt his rookie season in Cincinnati. Everyone's like, you know what? I think people were kind of torn on what Joe Burrow was going to be moving forward. And now we're sitting here having the conversation about who's a better quarterback between Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow, when Justin Herbert was all the rave last season, and rightfully so. But Joe Burrow is the only one that made the playoffs and is still playing in the playoffs. And I think that exemplifies what makes a $40 million quarterback, which I know Joe Burrow isn't that right now, but Cincinnati can build up that roster because he's still on his rookie contract. I promise you Joe Burrow is going to be a $40 million quarterback at some point if he continues playing like he is right now. but we're seeing the team find success around him because they can go out and get some key free agent additions and build around him and do different things. I think there's a lot of people that were upset in Cincinnati that they didn't draft a tackle and they drafted Jamar Chase instead. I'll say that project worked out well as well. So I think that is a good example of the quarterbacks that we saw. And then you switch over to Matthew Stafford and Jimmy Garoppolo, which I think kind of represent more of a Kirk Cousins stature. But I think at the end of the day, you see those guys go out. They're great leaders. They have great attributes, and they just play with a different type of swagger.
Yeah, the main thing that separates those quarterbacks, and those quarterbacks are all-time, right? They're Hall of Fame quarterbacks if they continue this trajectory, the best quarterbacks in the league. We're not arguing that Kirk Cousins is that, but the main thing that keeps Kirk, from being on that level, to me, is simply the improvisation. When things break down, when adversity strikes, how do they handle it? And Patrick Mahomes is the king of coming up with a way to keep a play going and make a goofy throw. We saw that from Josh Allen, back foot throws, backyard football kind of things. They also, and as awkward as Patrick Mahomes looks doing it, they're mobile quarterbacks, right? Josh Allen, part of their game plan is him running. He's huge, he's fast, and he has the intelligence to avoid getting hurt and to avoid those opportunities to find holes and make yardages and touchdowns out of those runs. That's part of their game plan. That's not part of the game plan with Kirk Cousins. He does not look like a gazelle. He looks like a giraffe when he runs. So you have those differences there. Patrick Mahomes also looks like a giraffe, but somehow he makes it work, and got it going on this last week and used his legs to move the ball a couple times. And did he score a touchdown? Or he had that long run for sure in the first half. But anyways, those are the differences between that level of a $40 million quarterback and Kirk Cousins. How do you value that? Like, what's the difference? Is Kirk Cousins a $35 million quarterback, a $30 million quarterback? I think that's more the range we're talking. And then you talk about if it's worth it. Is it worth it to your team to have that much money invested? I think a lot of Vikings fans would say that's much more palatable. Gives you the opportunity to find offensive linemen, maybe some more weapons around him, and expand on that defense, which is paper thin right now. That, to me, those are the differences. You can read more about that at KFAN.com. Jack's covered it. He's covered the upcoming quarterback class and what that might look like for the team if they do go young there as well.
I want to touch on one little quick thing on that, because people are talking about after that game, and rightfully so, they're saying the term generational talent. I think it's thrown around a little bit too lightly today, but they weren't generational talents. They weren't Trevor Lawrence, Andrew Luck, Peyton
Not out of the draft.
They were not clear-cut home runs when they entered into the NFL. I think Josh Allen was the 7th overall pick and the 3rd quarterback in his class. Mitchell Trubisky was looked at by a lot of scouts as a better NFL quarterback than Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes is drafted 10th overall. So that just I'm trying to think of how I said this. I've had this in my head for all week because it's been the only thing that I've seen on Twitter. But being willing to take a guy with good traits and develop him into a franchise caliber quarterback is something that the Minnesota Vikings haven't done in my lifetime. I am 26 years old, and I haven't been able to see that where they draft someone, develop him, and then extend him because, hey, he's good enough to be tagged a franchise caliber quarterback. They haven't had that. They've had rental quarterbacks. They had Dante Culpepper when I was in elementary school, which I think is the closest thing they've had to that type of franchise guy. But I think with a new GM and a new head coach, you have to find who your quarterback of the future is. And I just don't think that Kirk Cousins is the answer there, especially with his cap hit in 2022.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Jack, let's go to the Q&A session. If you haven't put a question in the comment section, feel free to do that. We're going to whip through some of these here just to get some opinions maybe on what's happening in Minnesota Vikings world, because there's a lot going on right now. Jack, I want to start with this one that came in earlier. Now I lost it. Rory, where are you at? Rory had a comment. Here we go. Rory Kuiper had a comment. He wants to know what's going to happen with Kellen Mond now that the attention has completely shifted. I'll go real quick first. I think Mond is out as soon as there's an opportunity. That first year didn't work. Kwesi Adofo-Mensah has no ties to Kellen Mond. It doesn't seem like he's developing into what they thought. And the first opportunity to whether he's a backup quarterback, I think that might feel like what the ceiling is right now. But any opportunity and any thoughts of developing Kellen Mond into a starting quarterback, I think are gone.
I might take the other side of the spectrum here because they come in and they don't really know what they have. I mean, they know about Kirk Cousins. They haven't seen Kellen Mond play live, meaningful football since his days at Texas A&M, where he was getting better throughout all 4 seasons at Texas A&M. I think there's been this goes back to what I was just saying when we were last talking. The Vikings haven't been able to develop quarterbacks, quite frankly. They have Teddy Bridgewater, it felt like they were close. That Chargers preseason game is one that lives in the head of many Vikings fans until that rough Tuesday afternoon that following week. But Kellen Mond is on he's on a rookie-friendly or team-friendly deal, obviously, because he's still on his rookie contract for the next 4 seasons, 3 seasons, whatever it is. I think you have to come in and at least see if you can bring in your new coaching staff. I don't think they're going to necessarily dump all of the coaches. I think there's a couple names that come to mind. Jefferson and Thielen. We're talking about trying to keep McCardle on that wide receiver staff, which I think would be a very good thing for them to do. But I think you have to bring in someone here that you think can develop quarterbacks better than what the status quo has been in Minnesota. Retool Mond a little bit. I think his mechanics were probably one of the biggest worrisome spots coming out of college. He was just such a stiff. I mean, he's a very athletic quarterback, but he just doesn't, similar to a Patrick Mahomes, he doesn't look athletic. He plays stiff and his throwing mechanics are kind of off, but retool with Mond and see what you have. I don't think necessarily they're going to kick him to the curb right away. Maybe if a trade offer comes up and they can get that 3rd round draft pick they used on him back, maybe they'll consider that. But I don't think, I think Mond's going to be here for at least the short term next couple of years.
Here's an interesting one. We talk about that pipeline between Cleveland and Minnesota. What about the pipeline between San Francisco and Minnesota? Clearly, they drafted Trey Lance as a quarterback, but there were rumors prior to, maybe even after that, about Kirk Cousins being traded to San Francisco and what that might look like. The question from Mudcat, does Mensah have any connection with Jimmy Garoppolo and the Niners to facilitate a deal to the Vikings? The connection's there. Any interest in maybe that being I'll pull up his contract while you talk about the play. Any interest in Jimmy Garoppolo coming to Minnesota?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a bridge type quarterback for 1 year, then maybe. If we're straight up doing a flip flop and trading Kirk Cousins, I don't think personally that might have to be something more of like a 3-team deal. Because I don't think I think there's a lot of people in that 49ers building that really have a lot of faith in Trey Lance. I don't think they would want to start Kirk Cousins in 2022. Having said that, if it comes down to the Vikings think that they can contend in 2022 and they're going to either go with Kirk Cousins or Jimmy Garoppolo, I'm keeping Kirk Cousins, riding out that final deal because I think Kirk Cousins is a much better quarterback than Jimmy Garoppolo.
So here is what Garoppolo's contract looks like. It is nearly a $27 million cap hit. That's not enough of a difference. I think we need to get more money to build the team if we're going to move on from Kirk Cousins this year. Now, the opportunity might be there's just a $1.4 million dead cap hit. So you cut him prior to any opportunities. That's where you can save the money there. I still don't think that's good enough. I think that they would rather ride it out with Kirk this season. Do what they can to develop and fill some of those gaps around him, and then address it going forward, either through free agency and a bridge player, and or the draft when the quarterback gets to be a little bit more of a appealing position in that draft next year rather than this year. Question from Daniel File: who misses me more in the office, Jack or AJ? I don't remember Daniel. Do you remember Daniel?
I haven't been in the office since Daniel was in the office.
Like my first day here, right? Daniel's a good guy. We miss him. One more question, Jack, and then we'll get out of here. I saw another good one. Where did it go? Oh, Brandon O. Head coach is the next big domino, but do you think, guys, that Mensah brings in an assistant general manager to help him and have another set of eyes on things? Jack, I think this goes back to PA kind of talking about facilitating responsibilities. First-time general manager. So I feel like, yes, there will be an assistant general manager to spread some of that wealth, spread some of those responsibilities. Mensah is the final, Adofo-Mensah is the final decision maker, but you bring another assistant general manager in. He's familiar with that sort of a position in Cleveland, and I think in San Francisco they have both those positions there. They did have it here in Minnesota before Peyton went to Denver. They didn't rehire for this year. I think that that's a new thing in the NFL, and I think that a first-time general manager is more likely to do that than a long-time general manager. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of names worth monitoring that I've seen thrown out a handful of times already on Twitter. Andrew Berry stems from Philadelphia, so he has some people within that front office that I know Andrew Berry trusts, and the ties are there with Adofo-Mensah. And I think this would be a really, really cool hire if this were the case. There's been a little bit of a rumbling, like I said, on Twitter. But Catherine Raish apparently impressed in her interview. She is a part of that Philadelphia front office. I think she's stemmed from the Canadian Football League, if I'm remembering correctly. But now she's also kind of been a fast riser within that organization in Philadelphia. And I think that would be really cool to bring her in, because it would be technically a promotion from what her role is in Philly. So bring her in for that role, and hey, the Vikings get 2 of their candidates that they interviewed for GM instead of just 1.
Right. I lied. Final question from Itzmer. Who wore the backwards hat better, Jack or AJ? I'm going to take the cake on this one. Not that I take the credit, but I'm going to give it to Jack because I wasn't planning on backwards hat. I'm in the office, so I don't have my light set up. So when I did this and I saw how dark my face was, I opted to go backwards hat. It might have been a bad decision, Jack. I'm going to give you the credit on that one. You rock the backwards hat better than I do.
We did make it through the question session. I can say this safely now. Maybe it's still sitting in there if it has been asked. My dad was kind of giving me some grief he said he was going to try to bring up Sean Payton and lie about some sort of friendship between Kwesi and Sean Payton, just because people love getting me riled up about Sean Payton. I'm glad we're able to make it through that. I thought it was one of my favorite tweets that I've ever had. When they announced that Sean Payton was gone, I tweeted the gif of Michael Scott doing the Goodbye Toby dance when he's singing for Toby. If you're a fan of The Office, I thought that was hilarious. I don't think it got the recognition that it deserved, but at the end of the day, Sean Payton's out of the NFL. I hope to God that doesn't mean we're going to have to listen to him and Jonathan Vilma do Vikings game up in the broadcast booth, but that will be a battle for another day.
I love when your dad trolls us on Twitter, trolls you specifically. I didn't see that. He did. I'm going to pull this one up because he did mention Brian O'Neill added to the Pro Bowl roster today, as Tristan Wirfs, I think, was backed out because of injury or something. But Brian O'Neill now a Pro Bowl right tackle. So congratulations to him. That's your dad's contribution to the show today, Jack. So one final thing as we are closing out here, I'm going to pull it up on the screen. We do have a Twitter poll of the week. I put it out on my Twitter at AJKFAN. I'll pull up the current results, Right now, the question, as it appears that Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is now the new general manager for the Minnesota Vikings. How does this hire make you feel about the future of the team? Does it excite you? Does it do nothing for you? Or is the jury still out? Right now, the excites me is leading 62.3%, does nothing for me 9%, and 28.7% still needs to see more. So if you want to partake in that poll, head over to Twitter now. You can find it twitter.com/AJKFAN. If you want to follow Jack on Twitter, where'd my screen go? There we go. You can follow him at Jack_H_day on Twitter for the latest Minnesota Vikings news and maybe that head coaching news coming later this week or earlier next week or over the weekend. Just our luck, Jack. It's going to happen Saturday night when none of us are paying attention or want to be paying attention, and we're going to have to hop on and get some stuff taken care of. Jack, any final thoughts or closing things that we missed on your side?
I don't think so. I think that poll should be 100%. It excites me because it's unknown, and I don't think, like I said at the beginning of the show, none of us have any clue how this is going to pan out. We'll talk about this 3-4 years down the road, and it's either going to be, hey, that was an amazing hire for the Vikings, this analytical guy who the nerds absolutely love. He killed it. There's people tweeting that he is going to kill it, people that he's worked with saying that it is a home run hire. He's a genius. So that should be exciting for Vikings fans. And let's just push out the negative for now, because we don't need to get to that point until this roster is in complete flames 3-4 years down the road.
Well, yeah, and hopefully it doesn't get to that point. But Jack, thank you again. Follow Jack on Twitter to stay in tune with the latest Minnesota Vikings news. If you want to find old episodes of the State of Purple podcast, you can find them iHeartRadio, iTunes, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. You can get them there. Subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. So for this week, it's been a fun one, Jack. This is going to be a fun off season, lots of speculation, and it just continues through the weekend and into next week. Thank you, Jack. Appreciate your time. Thank you, Pilot Games. Thank you, all the listeners and viewers, for making this an interactive, fun opportunity for us. Until next week, for next week's episode of the State of Purple podcast, I'm Aj Mansour. He's Jack Day, and we'll see you next time.
10 seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Diggs. Stay up.